Class 7th, Subject English, Topic The Red-Headed League, Part 1. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, he was born on 22nd May 1859 and he died on 7th July 1930. He was a British writer and physician. He created the character Sherlock Holmes in 1887 for a study in scarlet. The first of 4 novels and 56 short stories about Holmes and Dr. Watson. The Sherlock Holmes stories are considered milestones in the field of crime fiction. The Red-Headed League, Part 1, Mr. Wilson's Story. When I cried upon my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, he was conversing with a visitor. Conversing means talking, who was an elderly man with fiery red hair. Holmes introduced me to the visitor, Mr. Jabez Wilson. He was pawnbroker. Holmes asked him to repeat his story for me. He began by showing us an advertisement in a newspaper. It read as follows: To the Red-Headed League. There is a vacancy for a member of the League. League means an association or a formal group of people. And the salary is £4 a week for nominal services. Red-headed men may apply in person on Monday at 11 o'clock to Duncan Ross at the office of the League, 7 Fleet Street. So, Mr. Holmes was conversing with a visitor who was an elderly man with red hair, and Holmes introduced the visitor. He was Mr. James Wilson and he was a pawnbroker. So he asked him to repeat his story and he began by showing an advertisement in a newspaper. The advertisement was given in the newspaper to the Red-Headed League, and there was a vacancy for a member of the League and a salary of £4 a week. Red-headed men may apply in person on Monday at 11 o'clock to Duncan Ross at the office of the League, 7 Fleet Street. The advertisement had appeared in newspaper 2 months ago. Mr. Wilson's assistant, Vincent Spondling, had shown it to him. Mr. Wilson liked his assistant Spondling. He was smart, efficient, and worked for only half the normal wages. But the assistant also had his faults. Every now and then he left work and went down into the cellar to develop photographies. Photography was his hobby. So the advertisement was given in the newspaper and it had appeared in newspaper 2 months ago. And Wilson Spondling was the assistant of Mr. Wilson's and he was working in Mr. Spondling's house. And he had shown him the advertisement to Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson liked his assistant Spondling very much because he was smart, well organized, and he worked for only half the normal wages. But the assistant Spondling had his faults. Every now and then he used to leave his work and go down into the cellar to develop photography, as photography was his hobby. Spondling showed the advertisement to Mr. Wilson and explained to him that an American millionaire, Mr. Ezekiel Hoppings, had found the famous Red-Headed League to help all redheads like himself. Spondling urged Mr. Wilson to apply for the job. So, the two of them went to the address given in the advertisement. Fleet Street was full of red-headed people. Mr. Wilson thought that with so much competition, he would not get the job. He wanted to go back, but Spondling pushed through the crowd and took Mr. Wilson to the office. So, Spondling had showed the advertisement to Mr. Wilson and had explained him that an American millionaire, Mr. Ezekiel Hoppins, he had founded this famous red-headed league and he wanted to help all the redheads like him. So, Spondling encouraged Mr. Wilson to apply for the job, and then the both of them together went to the address given in the advertisement. And the address was Fleet Street, so they reached there and it was full of red-headed people. So, Mr. Wilson thought that with so much competition, he would not get this job. So he wanted to go back, but Spondling pushed through the crowd and took Mr. Wilson to the office. There was nothing in the office but a couple of chairs and a table. A red-headed man sat behind the table. He was Mr. Duncan Ross, a representative of the Red-Headed League. He was very pleased to see Mr. Wilson and announced immediately that he was well suited for the job. He shook hands with Mr. Wilson, congratulated him, and told all other candidates to go back. Mr. Duncan Ross explained that Mr. Wilson would have to be in the office from 10 to 2. If he left the office, he would lose the job. Spondling assured Mr. Wilson that he would look after Mr. Wilson's business in his absence. The pay was fixed at £4 a week. So, as soon as they went to the office, there was nothing in the office but a couple of chairs and a table. And they found a red-headed man who was sitting there behind the table. He was none other than Mr. Duncan Ross, a representative of Red-Headed League, and he was very pleased to see Mr. Wilson and announced immediately that he was well suited for the job. So he shook hand with Mr. Wilson and he congratulated him because he had got selected for the job. So he congratulated him and told all the other candidates to go back. So, Mr. Duncan Ross explained that Mr. Wilson would have to be in the office from 10 to 2. So, the timing was given to Mr. Wilson and he had to be in the office in that time. And if he left the office, he would also lose his job. So, Spondling, who is the assistant of Mr. Wilson, assured that he would look after Mr. Wilson's business in his absence, and the pay was fixed at £4 a week. And the work, said Mr. Wilson, you have to copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica. The pay was very good and the work was light. Mr. Wilson accepted the job and began his work the very next day. Mr. Duncan Ross was there in the office to see that Mr. Wilson did his work properly and did not leave the office. He told Mr. Wilson to start with the letter A. Mr. Wilson wrote diligently. Diligently means with care and effort for 4 hours without leaving his place. Mr. Ross would drop in from time to time to see that all was right with Mr. Wilson. At 2 o'clock, he bade Mr. Wilson good day and locked the door of the office. So, Mr. Wilson asked Mr. Duncan Ross about the work, and his work was to copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica. And the pay was good and the work was very easy. So, Mr. Wilson accepted the job and he began to work the very next day. So, Mr. Duncan Ross every now and then was there in the office to see that if Mr. Wilson did his work properly and did not leave the office. And he had told Mr. Wilson to start with the letter A. So, Mr. Wilson wrote very neatly and carefully for 4 hours without leaving his place. And Mr. Ross would come to check from time to time that all was right with Mr. Wilson. So, after that, at 2 o'clock, told Mr. Wilson good day and then he locked the door of the office. This went on day after day. Mr. Holmes, said Mr. Wilson, and on Saturday I got my salary. It was the same next week and the same the week after. After a few days, Mr. Duncan Ross came in only once in a while, and after a time he did not come in at all. Mr. Wilson continued, 8 weeks had passed like this, and I had written about abbots, archery, etc., and hoped that I might get on the bee soon. And then suddenly the whole business came to an end. To an end? Holmes asked. So, Mr. Wilson is telling Mr. Holmes that this went on day after day, and on Saturday he had got his salary, and this was same the next week and the week after. But after a few days, Mr. Duncan Ross came in only once in a while, and after that he did not come in at all. So this continued till 8 weeks and passed like this. And still he was on the letter A, and he hoped that he would get on to letter B soon. But then suddenly the whole business, it came to an end. Yes, sir. This morning I went to my work as usual at 10 o'clock, but the door was shut and locked with a little note nailed on it. It said, "The Red-Headed League is dissolved. October 9, 1880." I was shocked. I did not know what to do. Mr. Wilson went on with his story. I made inquiries at the nearby offices, but no one of them knew anything about the league. The rooms had been rented under a false name. So, one morning he went there to his work as usual at 10 o'clock. But the door was locked, and there was a little note nailed on it which said, "The Red-Headed League is dissolved," and the date was mentioned, that is October 9, 1880. After seeing that, he was shocked and he did not know what to do. So, after all this, Mr. Wilson went with his story and he made inquiries about it in the nearby offices, but none of them knew anything about the league. And the rooms which were rented under a false name. I went home and asked my assistant, Spondling, for advice, but he could not help him in any way. I want to find out about the league, Mr. Holmes, who they are, and why they planned this prank upon me. The whole thing is a mystery. This is why I came to you. I have heard a lot about you. Holmes found Mr. Wilson's story very unusual. He asked, "Mr. Wilson's, this assistant of yours who first called your attention to the advertisement, what is he like?" So he went home and asked his assistant Spondling for an advice, but he could not help him in any way. So he wanted to find out about the league. So he had heard about Mr. Holmes. So he went to Mr. Holmes and told him who they were and why such type of prank was played upon him. And the whole thing was a mystery. So this is why he went to Mr. Holmes, because he had heard about Mr. Holmes. And after listening to all this, Holmes found Mr. Wilson's story very uncommon. So he asked Mr. Wilson about the assistant, as he was the first to draw your attention to the advertisement. So he asked him what he is like. Small, stout, with no hair on his face. He has a white splash of acid on his forehead. I thought as much, said Mr. Holmes. Is he still with you? Oh, yes, sir. That will do, Mr. Wilson. I can give you my opinion on the subject in a day or two. Today is Saturday, and by Monday we may come to a conclusion. So, He was small, stout, and had no hair on his face, and he also had a white mark on his forehead. So, Holmes asked Mr. Wilson if he was still with him, and he replied yes, and he was looking forward to get an opinion on this subject in a day or two, and that day was Saturday, and by Monday he would come to a conclusion. Answer the following questions. First one is, what do you have to do when you are told to apply in person? So, if you have to apply in person for a job, what you have to do, you have to answer. Second one is, how were photographers developed in those days? So, in earlier times, how was the photographers developed? You have to answer. Third one is, who do you think is smarter, Mr. Wilson or his assistant? Why? So, what do you think, who is smarter, Mr. Wilson or his assistant? You have to answer, and why he is smart, you have to answer. Fourth one is, why was Fleet Street full of red-headed people? So, why was the Fleet Street full of red-headed people? What was the reason? You have to answer. Fifth one is, who was well suited for the job? So, who was well suited for the job? You have to answer. Sixth one is, why did Mr. Wilson accept the job? So, why and what was the reason that Mr. Wilson accepted the job? You have to answer. Seventh one is, would you like to do such a job? Why? So, this is a personal response question, and would you like to do such type of job, and what is the reason why you would like to do such job? You have to answer. Eighth one is, what is the difference between a dictionary and an encyclopedia? So you have to write down the difference between a dictionary and an encyclopedia, and you have to answer. Pick out the adjectives. First one is, the pay was very good and the work was light. Second one is, and then suddenly the whole business came to an end. Third one is, the rooms had been rented under a false name. Fourth one is, Holmes found Mr. Wilson's story very unusual. So, you have to pick out the adjectives from the given sentences. Thank you.